Welcome to the Great British Foreign Affairs Podcast, hosting insightful conversations with fascinating people to shape the way that Britain interacts with the world. As we come into land at the end of Series 3, in this episode, I talk about Turkey with Sami Kent, journalist and radio producer, and author of a new book on Turkey called The Endless Country. So welcome, Sami. We are both Hackney based. We connected through the Stoke Newington Literacy Festival, didn't we? And I was really excited to find your book, because I've been looking for someone that could come onto the podcast to talk about Turkey. And here we are. Absolutely fascinating country, both in and of itself, but also in its place in the world. So, Sami, would you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your book to start off?
Yeah, hi, thanks for having me. So, my name's Sami Kent. I'm a journalist and an audio producer, and my day job is I work for another podcast, which is The Guardian's Today in Focus, a daily news podcast. So I work there as a producer. But more pertinently to the book, I am half Turkish, half English. I grew up in the UK. My father is the Turkish one. And we grew up with a slightly, I guess a kind of an interesting but maybe typical relationship with that kind of second country for many people, I think, who have links from another place. That Turkey was like a really beloved place for us, but it was also slightly at a distance. And partly the reason it was at a distance was that my baba didn't really teach us much Turkish beyond the kind of words for ordering food at restaurants and abusing football referees. But it was also a place that we went every year. It was a place where we went to visit our family in Istanbul, or went to these holidays on the coast, which were these kind of like really treasured memories of my childhood. And something I say in the book is that a really clear memory I have when I was about 6 or 7 was me in the 90s. Turkey had kind of rampant inflation, and I remember my dad giving me this purple million lira note, which is about the value of £1. And that money, as in all money in Turkey, had the face of Turkey's founder and first president, Ataturk, stamped on it. His face is stamped on all currency. And I remember holding this note and being really excited and thinking, I'm a millionaire. And my dad was also very enthusiastic, but his enthusiasm was very different. And he looked at my face and my slightly fair hair and the face of Ataturk, and he said, "You look just like him," which really, really, really wasn't true, especially when I was 7. And that relates to the book, really, because a lot of what the book is about, or a lot of who my family were these really enthusiastic advocates. They weren't particularly influential, but they were enthusiastic supporters of that project of Ataturk, which was to, in the 1920s and 30s, to modernize and secularize and westernize Turkey. And it was very top down. And what a lot of my book does is follow the impact of that project in the ways, the kind of good and bad, that it transformed the country. So it's a story of Turkey, but it's also a story, like, kind of unashamedly, of my relationship to Turkey and my family's relationship to Turkey.
We should say its name at this point, I guess, shouldn't we?
Yeah.
So it's called The Endless Country, a personal journey through Turkey's first 100 years.
Exactly, yeah.
Right?
So it is that kind of personal element of it as well. That's kind of also a big part of the book. My editor was kind enough to say that she thought it's not a story just about Turkey. In a way, it's also about modernity in itself and about how countries try and achieve it in a way that's relevant to a lot of countries around the world. And so what my book does is follow the stories of a lot of people who are affected by that top-down project, whether they be Islamists or Kurds, for example, or radical leftists, or women who didn't necessarily fit in the place of the Republican ideal of Turkey. And I think it's a lot of what ties all the stories together is a question that kind of maybe comes more naturally to someone like me, who is kind of half in and half out of Turkey, which is basically, what is Turkey and who is it for? But there are also stories about Olympic weightlifters who are less than 5 feet tall and who are kind of the strongest, I think, who was the strongest man the world has ever seen, and about ice creams that are made from the roots of orchid flowers. It's also kind of a lot of life and color and texture in there, because essentially it is a book about a place that I have known and loved as long as I've known and loved anywhere, because Turkey was 100 years old in 2023, so it basically is the story of Turkey's first 100 years, but in the form of these kind of stories.
Yeah, I love that. That strikes you at the beginning, even. It's the first 100 years, and yet, of course, it's a country or a land with a very long history. And it is, again, a reminder, as often happens in this podcast, of countries that have shaped their national identity as their modern state recently still. And that makes it very interesting, because as you tell the story, you're telling living history story almost, aren't you? You've started there telling some of the stories. I was so struck by that, like such a book full of such wonderful stories, basically. And I just wondered, for the podcast listeners, whether you could tell a few of those. You've obviously, that one of You with the Money is very striking. Just a few of the stories that say something quite powerful to you about who Turkey is now.
Yeah, so the form of the book is basically more or less, for each decade of Turkey's history, I tell a story of something, a real historic episode, and a story about something that at its heart that I find is just like a great yarn, like a story I'd want to tell someone, but also speaks to something bigger about Turkey's past, and also, as you say, about its present. And what I do is, so for each decade, for each story, I go to the place where this happened. I talk to a lot of witnesses, family members, survivors. As you say, it is living history. I interview people in the book who are older than Turkey itself, who are 103 or something. Also, they claim, it's hard to tell, and they're not really sure how old they are, but everyone goes along with it at least. So one of the stories, for example, one of the first stories in the book is about something that happened actually very close to where my ancestral home is, in the northeast of Turkey, in the Black Sea, near a city called Rize, which is in this kind of in the 1920s, when Ataturk was in power, and it was essentially a dictator. It was an authoritarian government, and they're trying to transform Turkey and to rescue it from what it sees as this backward religious conservatism of what was the Ottoman Empire, and turn it into a modern nation state. And one of the things they decide that they need to do is make Turks dress in modern civilized ways. And in 1925, what that essentially means is they outlaw the fez, which had been for 100 years the traditional hat of Turkish men in Turkey. Literally outlaw. And say, if you go out in public with a hat, which at that time, everyone goes out in public with a hat, it's unthinkable not to go with a kind of naked head. You have to wear a Western style hat with a peaked brim, called the shapka. And so this law is brought in, and most people kind of accept it because, I'm not going to lose much sleep over a hat. But in some places, there are rebellions, there are protests. And in the most dramatic place, in this village called Giresun, which is very close to Rize in the Black Sea in the northeast of Turkey, they kidnap 4 or 5 policemen, and as the story goes, they try and then they walk towards Rize, a couple of hours inland, and I don't know, to do whatever next in their rebellion. And the government in Ankara its response is to send a warship down the Black Sea coast, stationed outside Rize, and fire onto the hills of behind Rize. And this is remembered in a song there in the Black Sea, goes Hamidia, Hamidia, which is the name of the ship, Hamidia, 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 Atma, Atma. So Hamidia, Hamidia, don't fire, we'll wear our hats and we'll pay our taxes, is how the song goes. And this is, and in the end, the rebellion is put down, and I interview the grandson of someone who in the end was hanged on the beach for being part of this. And in a way, it's a fascinating story that, this kind of what these reforms really meant on the ground. But it also tells you a lot about that about Turkey in the 1920s and what it was trying to achieve, but also the fact that this song is still remembered, that it's still sung as a kind of nursery rhyme, slightly in jest, but people remember it. Tells you also something about how, like, the past in Turkey is just always with you. So the book is basically, it's a kind of full of those kind of stories. You said it's full of great stories. In Turkey, it's not hard to find them. They just present themselves and you just have to write them down, really.
Yeah, of course. Great storytelling and oral traditions. Have you got another one that's more, later on in the book?
Yeah,
or
maybe
that's more modern, perhaps.
Well, the last chapter is about covers contemporary Turkey and is about what at one point at least was the world's largest prison, and is now definitely one of them, called Silivri, which is just outside Istanbul. It was built in 2007-8 under the current government, under Erdogan, who has been in power since the party's been in power since 2002, so it's 22 years, either as Prime Minister or President. He has always been there. And the last chapter follows the story of this prison and it being built and who has been sent there, which involves activists, political prisoners, politicians, journalists, also tens of thousands of everyday petty criminals, I guess. And I speak to people who Silivri has 11,000 capacity, but around 22,000 prisoners currently. And I speak to many people who have been in there, also people who have worked there. And that chapter follows is the story of a family whose father, it's a family of three, a father, a wife, and their son, who's 3 years old, is only ever so slightly older than my son. And to be honest, I found it impossible not to see my own family kind of reflected in their story. It follows their stories as he is sent to Silivri on a kind of sham trial and how it has affected their life. And I interview the wife, and it's a story that is deeply personal to them. And I found it very moving, but it's also something that affects, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in Turkey. This kind of erosion of the rule of law and how the justice system has been so weaponized. And that is the kind of happy note on which the book ends, really, the contemporary Turkey and the story of this prison.
It's interesting that you were able to cover that in your book and able to do those interviews. There would be other countries where you wouldn't be able to do that.
In what sense not be able to do that?
Well, you would be, I guess, sacrificing your ties to a homeland by doing that. Or does that feel like that has been the case with this book for you?
It's a kind of open and live question, to be honest. I do not have Turkish citizenship, so that helps when you're working as a journalist in Turkey, that the worst that can happen is that you are not able to go back. But I know people who are in a very similar situation to I am, British Turks who have worked in Turkey, written something, and then not been able to go back. As far as I'm aware at the moment, that's not my situation. I've, of course, as I was writing the book, I was cognizant of the fact that writing about contemporary Turkey, contemporary authoritarian Turkey, that is always a real risk that you face. We took my family, we went on a holiday to Turkey just before the book was published, just on the off chance that it might not be, it might be a little harder to go back. I don't anticipate it should be a problem, but you just want to make sure. There's also, I have lots of family in Turkey still. I have friends in Turkey, and you feel the need to protect them in some way. You kind of obliquely refer to it, just if listeners aren't aware. Turkey is a country that, for a very long time, was the world's biggest jailer of journalists. It has, in the last 10, 15 years, seen a squeeze on personal freedoms, on political freedoms, on the freedom to associate. That is really, I think, by one measure, only Burundi in the world has made a bigger leap backwards. So these risks exist for me, but I wouldn't want to overplay it. There are astoundingly courageous people in Turkey who every day do their work with their Turkish citizenship and nowhere else to go but Turkey. As journalists, as lawyers, as activists, and I interviewed many of them over the years. At any point, they know that knock on the door, the banging on the door at 4 or 5 in the morning might happen, and the raid of your house and you being taken away to a police station, eventually maybe to Silivri prison or to one of the many, many prisons across Turkey can happen. What happens to me and my family, I don't know, but those I think are the people I'm always really astounded by, who have no other option, but still, because they believe in a different Turkey is possible, that they still carry out their work.
And of course, we would hope that there would be respect and appreciation as well for what a compelling book it is in terms of attracting people to understand more about Turkey. And I guess for the British who don't have links to Turkey, they might see it as a holiday destination, but really actually getting under the skin and appreciating such incredible history and culture. I was interested, actually. I was struck when I read a part of it. I'm just going to read a sentence up. You said near the beginning, I was interested in the politics, covering the pandemic, economic crises, political distance, but I was drawn back as well, not least as so much of Turks' understanding of what was happening to them seemed to rest on a broader sweep of history, of their stories from the past. Of course, politics everywhere is about stories, about carving beginnings, middles and ends out of reality. But in few places did they seem to matter so much. And I was struck by this because, of course, in this podcast, we're covering all sorts of different countries. And I always want to try and tease out of my guests, I guess, like how a country sees itself and how it sees itself historically in the world, because it makes such a difference to then how a country interacts with the rest of the globe. But I was really struck by that you were pulled to understand how is Turkey understanding itself. Do you want to say a bit about what you feel like you discovered?
Yeah, so to give it a bit of context to that, I have no doubt that Turkey is an authoritarian country that kind of only looks like a democracy from really quite a superficial level, and it is not really a democracy in any way that we understand it. But that is not to say that there are not a big swathe of the Turkish population who support the current government and what it does. And a lot of that, I think, comes from a sense of a kind of wounded dignity of what has happened in the past. And I think you see this not just in Turkey, but in a lot of places, that there is this discourse that we, for decades, have been, insulted, disrespected, we the people, by these elites who, in the Turkish case, for example, a very tangible example, if you were a woman, a young woman in Turkey in the 1980s, and you wanted to wear a headscarf, you could not enter a public university. As in, you couldn't go. And that kind of condescending, repressive policies, they have a really long tail. And you see now in Turkey that even 20 years into basically that side of Turkish politics being in power, there is still such a deep well of grievance, of insult to bring up, to kind of play on, and people still feel, yes, what is happening now is justified because of what they did in the past. And you see it a lot. And then on the other side, people say, this is just the old authoritarianism in a new form. Or people say, it's something completely different. But what you see in Turkey is, I think, this kind of weaponization of history, of stories of history. I remember when I was a student reading a historian, he said, to be a good historian is to give the dead room to dance, as in to basically say, we don't always know what they wanted to do or what their projects were, and we shouldn't use the dead for our own kind of battles. But in Turkey, they're not dancers. They are exactly soldiers. They are used every day. For example, that hat story that I mentioned, when I was in Rize, a guy there who was an Erdogan supporter said, look, now these days we can wear what we want. There's no one gets hanged for hat rebellions anymore. So how dare you in the West tell me that Turkey is not a democracy now? It was just seamless how he went from the past to the present. So, and I think a lot of in Turkey, it has its own specific color and tone, but the shape of that, I think, will be recognizable to a lot of countries in the world. This sense that, particularly in this moment, that people feel that there are these the kind of we, the people, have been patronized by people who are kind of more educated and who have been running the show for decades. And now, enough is enough. Yeter, as you'd say in Turkey, enough. But also, I think, to add to just a personal element to it as well, that Turkey, for me, I learned Turkey is a place of stories. And my Baba was like, my dad was always full of stories about what Turkey was like and what his childhood was like. And a lot of them, I think, the details of it were not necessarily, well, they definitely weren't true. Like, was my dad really the candidate for Eurovision in Turkey in the mid-1970s, only for Turkey to pull out in protest about Greek song about Cyprus? Frankly, I have no idea, and I don't really want to check. But Turkey is a nation that likes to tell stories and likes to believe in them, and you see that every day in just normal conversation, but you also see it in its politics.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting when you talk about the people enough, this sense of agency as well, which is bubbling very strongly, I think, particularly a lot amongst younger populations. And I've worked a lot in West Africa, and you see it very strongly there, this sense of wanting to see progress and opportunities for younger people, but also because of social media and seeing perhaps what other people have, the push and the drive for that actually being quite strong now. And it's interesting to hear, I guess, partly the Turkish version of that. I just wanted to quickly touch on elections, actually, because we started this podcast at the beginning of the year talking about over 40% of the world's population is going to the polls. Turkey had local elections and some interesting things happened there, some surprising things almost, right? Could you just fill us in on that?
Yeah, it was a surprise. So in late March, there were local elections in Turkey for mayors. And the kind of headline result was that the governing party, the governing kind of coalition, lost all major cities. And it was the first time that the kind of what is broadly called the left in Turkey won the elections, I think, since the 1970s. Since then, has always been a centre-right party who's been the biggest winner in elections. So it was a surprise. I wouldn't overdo exactly the kind of the political impact of that and what happens in the day today, because Turkey, especially since it passed constitutional reforms in recent years, is a very, very centralised system where the president has a lot of power. The judiciary is basically completely subservient. The legislature is also subservient. Mayors do not have a huge amount of power, but they do have some, and they control budgets. And just to add to that a lot of times in recent years, mayors, particularly Kurdish mayors in the southeast, have simply just been removed after they've been won elections on kind of spurious security terror grounds. So mayors do not have a huge amount of actual political power. But I think one thing I learned in Turkey was that even in kind of, let's call competitive authoritarian systems, for example, what is also really important is like a sense of momentum and a sense of hope. And when in the presidential elections last year in 2023, when Erdogan won again, slightly contrary to what a lot of people expected, it was really, really crushing to people. People had a kind of 4 or 5 years of thinking it might be over. And it was such a hammer blow. And you're talking to people in Turkey, a lot of people said, I'm just never going to vote again. I'm going to leave Turkey entirely. Talking to journalists who say people have stopped reading our site because they have no hope anymore and they just don't want to read about it. They've just resigned to this governing party being in power for as long as it wants because it basically has the power to do that. And I was there that night on the local elections and in a kind of a place that is an opposition stronghold in Istanbul. And I think just watching people drive through the night at 1 a.m, 2 a.m, 3 a.m, as we're trying to put our 2-year-old to sleep, honking their horns and being genuinely hopeful that basically there is still some fight here, that this is not all over, is actually a really important thing, regardless of what the actual political power that people have, that it gives them some hope that maybe in the next elections, with the right candidate and with the right set of circumstances, inshallah, there can be some kind of change. What the opposition was trying to do in Turkey in 2023, last year in the presidential elections, and what they'll try and do next time is basically unprecedented, which is you're trying to vote a dictator out of power. He has set up a system that is on the day basically fair, that the votes are counted, and the votes counted more or less, not entirely, but more or less fairly. People can go to the polls and they go in huge numbers in Turkey. But everything before that day is so unfair that it's really, I think it's always important to remember this is not really a democracy in a way that people would recognize, that the media is 90% controlled by the government. All the best and brightest opposition politicians are jailed or have these kind of spurious judicial actions against them. People are terrified to say what they think. They can't go out and protest. It's really, really not a democratic system as people would recognize it. But I think it is actually Turkey. Maybe if people take away their kind of like Europe, Western lens, there are lots of countries that look like this, that have elections, but then everything before is so skewed that it makes it very, very difficult. And I think we do need to find a kind of different vocabulary for describing what these systems are really. But there is some hope that people always have, that even with all those disadvantages, if you get everything right and they do everything wrong on the day, maybe it will change. And I think that people that, again, in Turkey have that hope after the local elections, that looking ahead already to the next presidential elections, maybe it will be different.
Yeah, it's an amazing description. I'd love to now, just for this final section, just talk about Turkey in the world. So I wondered if you could share your reflections on Turkey's place in the world. It's a very interesting country geopolitically, but how it sees itself on the global stage, and perhaps what you think the UK should be understanding about Turkey in the world.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like, this is such a live question in Turkey, and how Turks see their place in the world is also, it's a divisive question in Turkey. What Turks see where their country is very different, depends what Turk you ask. But it's a very common experience I get in Turkey, especially because people kind of see me as one of them. Especially there's a kind of logic of patrilineal bloodlines in Turkey. That if your father is Turkish, you are Turkish no matter where you grew up. And so people kind of often take me in as one of them, but they know that I have this link to the outside world. And I get asked often, just by people on the street, Sami, what do they think about us there? People care. And frankly, the answer I normally say is, you know what, people don't really talk about Turkey that much. But, there is a sense in Turkey, I think, is kind of very widely shared. There's this kind of distrust of the Western powers, the greater powers in the world, also sometimes laced with a bit of jealousy, a bit of laced with a kind of, we also want to be part of this club. If you look at recent years in the government, President Erdogan is definitely trying to, slightly position Turkey away from what its traditional geopolitical place has been, which was for years a kind of solid Cold War ally. Turkey was in NATO for years. Obviously, as everyone knows, it was applying for EU membership, and technically still is. And to move Turkey into more of a space of its own, something between Europe and the Middle East, also with a slightly ambivalent relationship with Russia, that is just something kind of it, sui generis. But that is, even Erdogan, who kind of, and people within his circle, you can still kind of see sometimes when they speak about the West, this kind of feeling also that at times they care what the West thinks, that it's still a kind of alive, that it's a sore, basically. And a lot of this comes, Turkey was formed. This is the first chapter of my book, really, that Turkey was formed out of the Ottoman Empire collapsing, and France, the UK, particularly Greece, Italy, wanting to carve Turkey up into a kind of a rump of a nation that would have really been very, very small, with very hard to survive. And Turkish nationalists fought back and established what are the modern borders of Turkey. And it was the only example of a country that lost the First World War, had a treaty imposed on it, but then reversed that treaty. The Sèvres Treaty, it was reversed. But this has left a legacy in Turkey, this kind of deep-seated feeling that the West is quite often trying to undermine you, trying to exploit divisions within you with Armenians or Kurds or with whoever, and trying to divide Turkey. And that you see both on the kind of governing side of Turkey, but also in the opposition. It's a very strongly held belief. I remember talking to someone in a Turkish bath who was trying to tell me that the earthquake in Turkey last year was caused by Americans bombing tectonic plates underneath Turkey, which is obviously complete nonsense, but that this belief exists. This stuff is there and it's powerful. But there's also another side of Turkey that is desperately wants to be. It sees itself as European and it's Western, and I think says that mostly as a metaphor for meaning we want to have the freedoms that that we used to have, or that we think that exist in the West. Personal freedoms, political freedoms, the freedom to just go out and feel under less pressure than people do at the moment. I mean, I think a lot of that argument in Turkey about what Turkey's place in the world is actually really it's an argument about what Turks would like Turkey to look like itself, not necessarily about what they'd like its relationship to be like with the rest of the world, if that makes sense.
And what should the UK not miss in its relationship with Turkey?
I mean, I guess you alluded to it in a way earlier. A lot of people see Turkey as this kind of glorious tourist destination, and it really is. It's a beautiful country with an amazing culture, and the food is something I miss. Every day I'm not eating it. But it also has this kind of a darker side to it that I would wish people would engage with a bit more. And I think people have slightly missed in the last 10 years. how much it is changed as a country. On a policy level, on a kind of a more elite level, I mean, the one thing I would say that I wish that, a lot of leverage that Erdogan and the government in Turkey have with Europe specifically, but I guess also at times with the UK, is that Turkey, to its credit, has taken 3.5-4 million Syrian refugees in the last 4 years and has politicized that issue, both in Turkey, but also with outside neighbors, with European neighbors threatening to kind of send them across the border. In a way, Europe and the UK has kind of outsourced its dirty work to Turkey, and kind of wants to forget its own kind of humanitarian responsibilities, and basically pays Turkey off to deal with that. In a way that gives Turkey a lot of leverage in kind of geopolitical conversation. And so, I think Britain in a way needs to also have a conversation more honestly with itself about its place in the world and the kind of responsibilities,
That's the perfect place to land. Thank you, Sami. What an amazing and interesting conversation. And I just love how there are so many layers. It's really looking at the nuances and the complexity and the contrasts that sit next to each other. And I think that's such a fascinating invitation for people to connect and engage more with what is happening in Turkey and with Turkey as a nation, proud of its history and cultural identity, and also grappling perhaps with how it moves forward. Do you want to just tell people how can people follow you or find you? Where can they find your book?
Well, you should be able to find my book in all good bookshops, as they say, also on Amazon. And if you want to follow me, I'm on Twitter at Sami Kent, SamiKent. And also, my daily work. I work for Today in Focus podcast. I hope you don't mind me plugging a rival podcast.
No, please do.
I'm really proud of the work we do there. And so listen to Stay in Focus every day. Well, you won't hear my voice, lucky for you, but you will hear my work behind the scenes. And we cover a lot of stuff there, including sometimes Turkey, but mostly British politics and all other things.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sami. Thank you for your time and all the best.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Great British Foreign Affairs podcast, where Britain meets the world. Subscribe today, share it with a friend or colleague, and be part of shaping Britain's role on the global stage.